In the shipyards of Glasgow, a dream was being forged in steel. The HMS Empress of Ireland, built to conquer the Atlantic, carried thousands of lives between Europe and Canada for nearly a decade. She was a floating city, a symbol of an era. But on the night of May 28, 1914, she sailed into a fog so thick that fate itself could not see through it. In less than 14 minutes, one of Canada's greatest maritime disasters unfolded in silence on the St. Lawrence River. Over 1,000 souls vanished. The world would never forget, but few know the full story. This is where it begins. The river gave back what it could. Survivors arrived on shore, wrapped in borrowed coats, carrying nothing but the memory of those 14 minutes. The town of Rimouski, a quiet fishing community, became the center of one of the greatest rescue operations Canada had ever seen. News traveled by telegram and train, reaching Montreal, Ottawa, and beyond within hours. A nation fell silent. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence, the Empress of Ireland had already begun her transformation. From tragedy into history, the wreck settled into the riverbed, and the water slowly closed over her, keeping her secrets in the cold and the dark. As Canada mourned, the machinery of justice and inquiry began to turn. Hearings filled courtrooms in Quebec City, where officers, survivors, and officials reconstructed those fatal 14 minutes in dense fog. The S. Storsted, the Norwegian collier whose bow tore open the Empress, sat in port under scrutiny, its damaged hull a silent witness. Meanwhile, 167 members of the Salvation Army, bound for a London convention, were among the lost. Their headquarters in Toronto fell silent with grief. By winter, the dock where the Empress once stood was empty, but the river kept moving. Canada kept moving, and the wreck, cold and still, waited in the dark below. Decades passed, and the world moved on, through 2 world wars, through rebuilding, through a new Canada rising from the ashes of the early century. But in Rimouski, the memorial plaque on the waterfront never let the town forget. Deep below the St. Lawrence, the Empress waited in silence, slowly becoming part of the river itself. Then, in the 1960s, the first divers descended into the cold darkness and brought pieces of her back to the surface. Artifacts, evidence, memory made tangible. A nation began to remember when it had nearly forgotten. The story of the Empress of Ireland was not over. It was only just being rediscovered. By the 1980s, Canada had made a decision. The Empress of Ireland would not be forgotten, and she would not be looted. The Quebec government moved to protect the wreck as a heritage site, and the Musée de la Mer at Pointe-au-Père became her guardian on land. Divers brought up fragments of her world. Dishes, compasses, brass fittings, each object a message from 1914 sealed in cold water for decades. Descendants of survivors traveled to the riverbank to stand above where their ancestors had fought for their lives. The river offered no apology. It simply flowed, as it always had, wide and indifferent and eternal, carrying the memory forward whether the world was ready or not. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Empress of Ireland had become more than a shipwreck. She had become a pilgrimage. Descendants traveled from across Canada and Europe to stand above her resting place, to lay wreaths on the St. Lawrence, to read the names carved into memorial stones. The Musée de la Mer became a cathedral of memory, its halls filled with objects that had survived the cold and the dark for decades. Historians, divers, and documentary filmmakers began piecing together every detail of those 14 minutes. And as the year 2000 arrived, a new generation was learning for the first time what had been lost, and what had somehow, impossibly, been preserved. 100 years after the Empress of Ireland vanished beneath the St. Lawrence, Canada gathered to remember. On May 29, 2014, hundreds of descendants, officials, and historians stood at Pointe-au-Père as a floral wreath drifted slowly across the river toward the wreck site. Below the surface, divers placed a centenary plaque on the hull, a message from the living to the lost. The river accepted it in silence. For a century, the Empress had rested in cold darkness, slowly becoming part of the river itself. And yet her story had never felt more alive, told in museums, in documentaries, in the faces of grandchildren who carried the names of those who never came home. A century after the disaster, science and memory joined forces. Conservation laboratories carefully restored artifacts pulled from the cold riverbed: brass fittings, ceramic plates, personal objects frozen in time since 1914. Remotely operated vehicles descended into the wreck, revealing a structure slowly surrendering to the river. The steel that had once carried over 1,000 souls was being reclaimed, plate by plate, year by year. In Montreal, digital artists reconstructed the Empress in 3 dimensions: her grand dining saloons, her promenades, her engine rooms, bringing her back to life on screen. The river kept its silence, but the world was listening more carefully than ever before.